So good day, everyone. We're about to start this webinar on asset operations in Australia, how to monitor and steer solar plant performance. I'd like to welcome everyone dialing in from Australia and Asia, where it's already afternoon, but also people dialing in from Europe, where it's still early morning. So we have three speakers also on the line, David, Bea, and Ioannis, and I'll shortly introduce them later once we start the agenda for the day. I'd like to also mention that we're hosting this webinar from Solarplaza together with the Smart Energy Council in Australia, with whom we're in the run-up to our conference. So let's start and see what the agenda is for today. I'll give a first introduction first myself. My name is Lisette Buist. I'm a project manager at Solarplaza, and I'll walk you through the details of this webinar. After that, I'm happy to give the floor to our speakers. The first one, who is David Dixon, and he'll give us an Australian solar market update on utility scale PV and walk us a little bit through who the key players are and where we're heading in this market, to sketch also the background for our discussion on asset operations. After his talk, we'll have Bea talking about asset operations in Australia from an asset management perspective. So she'll give us an introduction on what asset management is, why it's important, and also some of the key characteristics that link to the Australian solar market. Once she is done, we'll have Ioannis from Inaccess talking about monitoring asset performance, so how you can actually use data, SCADA, to increase performance of solar assets, also linking it to the Australian space. Of course, we're happy to answer any questions that you have as an audience, so feel free to, throughout all the presentations, answer your questions. We'll deal with them in the Q&A at the end of the three presentations, and then we'll round off this webinar for today. So shortly about Solarplaza, for the ones of you who don't know it, we're a company based in the Netherlands. We're a platform for solar energy, and our mission is to positively impact the world by accelerating the sustainable energy transition. We do this by organizing conferences around the globe and by connecting our network of over 60,000 PV professionals globally. A short impression of our ecosystem, partners we've been working with in the past, and partners you can also expect to see in Australia. And these are a couple of names that have joined us on this journey around the globe. So then to the conference, because why we're organizing this webinar is in the run-up to our Solar Asset Management Conference in Australia, which will take place on the 26th and 27th of June in Sydney. It's going to be the inaugural edition of the Solar Asset Management Conference series in Australia, which is the leading global conference focused on operational phase of solar plants and portfolios, where we talk about mainly O&M topics and longer-term return on investment of operational solar plants. You can find more information about this on our website, but for now I only would like to highlight that you're all invited to join us in June. We would be happy to see you, and as you're attending this webinar, you're also able to claim a 5% discount at our website for the early bird rates, which expire by the end of this week. So hope to see you there. So some practical notes then before we go to our speakers. For any technical issues, we have a support team available, so please use the chat box in the GoToWebinar sidebar if you encounter any. All your questions that you have for our speakers, please raise them in the question box. We'll gather them and we'll get to them in the Q&A by the end of this webinar. Also, the slides are available in the handout section, so if you would like to have a look at the slides throughout the presentations, you're able to download them in the sidebar as well. But we will provide the recordings of the webinar plus the slides by email afterwards to all the registered attendees of this webinar. So then on to the main course of the day, the main topics we would like to discuss. I'm happy to soon give the floor to David. David Dixon is a senior analyst in Australian renewables at Rystad Energy in the Sydney office. He has over 6 years experience in the energy industry with companies like Shell, Woodside and Solgen Energy. He knows a lot about the solar market in Australia, so he's happy to give you some statistics and some data on where we're heading from Rystad's perspective. And he has an undergraduate degree in petroleum engineering and a master's in photovoltaic engineering from the University of New South Wales in Australia. So happy to have David on board. He will shortly introduce Rystad in his presentation as well, and then he will go on to the key questions of today that he will answer. So David, I'm happy to hand over the floor to you, and enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lizette, and thanks for the introduction. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank you all for attending this webinar. My name is David Dixon. I'm from Rystad Energy, and Rystad Energy is essentially a data research, gathering and intelligence organization. We essentially offer our clients software tools which essentially track the renewables and oil and gas markets depending on their interests. And we track projects and assets all the way through, from concept all the way through to operating, and gather data like project timelines, capacity, technology, stakeholders, geography. And we'll run through some of this data today to give you a snapshot of the market. So today I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of what's installed in the Australian market in the utility PV space and what's coming. I'll highlight some of the key challenges of the Australian market. We'll then delve a little bit deeper in what kind of technology is being used in utility PV in Australia, and then go into some of the stakeholders, the developers and the asset managers to lead into Bay's presentation. But before we get underway, we've got our first poll question for the webinar, which is essentially, which region are you currently working in at the present time? And this will just help us get an understanding of the level of background before going into this presentation.
Yes, so attendees are able to share their vote now. We're curious to see the results. David, what are your expectations?
I think given the time, I'd be highly suspicious if anyone in the Americas was online and as well. So I'm going to say Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific.
They will have the recordings at their availability afterwards. So let's see indeed if the Australians are the predominant people present. I think you are able to see the results now, David, aren't you?
Yeah, so 92% Australia and 8% covering Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia. So thank you to all those who are attending, and particularly to those waking up early in Europe. I understand it's very early over there. So what you see on screen here is essentially the amount of capacity that was commissioned by year for utility PV, wind, and storage in the Australian market. And you see that 2018 was a record year for the Australia renewables industry, and it was significant for multiple reasons. It's the first time that a utility PV wind storage industry commissioned over 1 gigawatt. It's also the first time that utility PV commissioned more than wind in a single year. And despite how big a year 2018 was, we expect 2019 and 2020 to surpass it by quite some distance. So you can see on the plot here that we're expecting in the order of 2 gigawatts each of utility PV and wind to be commissioned in 2019 and 2020. The picture isn't all rosy though. So the green box you see on the screen is essentially the amount of capacity that was delayed in 2018 and in terms of commissioning, and essentially had to move to 2019. In particular, the solar space, a lot of the RCR projects, which was obviously one of the biggest EPCs that went bust in 2018. And likewise, we could expect to see some slippage from 2019 to 2020. But this chart only includes committed projects, so those actually at financial close or under construction. So if we do see some more projects close within the next few months, we could expect the 2020 capacity commission to actually increase. So there is some upside as well. Now, our second poll question for this webinar is essentially, which state do you think has the most committed utility scale PV developments? Is it Queensland, our sunshine state, New South Wales, our most populous state, Victoria or South Australia, which have been very active renewable energy players, or our biggest state, Western Australia?
Okay, so as we have quite some Aussies in the audience, I'm very curious to see what the results of this poll will be. You already highlighted, David, a couple of reasons why each of these states might be the state with the most committed utility PV development. So curious to see what the audience thinks will be the state for this.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and that's the impression. So we've got the results up at the present, just in case anyone can't see. And 51% of the audience went with Queensland, and then second was New South Wales at 26%, and then third was South Australia, which has actually the highest share of variable renewable energy in the country. So the answer might surprise folk, but actually New South Wales is the state with the biggest pipeline in terms of what's committed in terms of past financial close under construction and operating, and it just beats Queensland's. And there's a few reasons for this. So we've seen a stalling in activity in Queensland, and we'll go into that in a bit more depth in the next slide, but also New South Wales, most populous state, the highest demand, as well as coal-fired generation starting to exit, or will start to exit the market over the next few years. It's an obvious place for investment. South Australia is actually, and Victoria, despite having a good pipeline of utility PV, are actually more predominantly wind states. So we're currently in not a drought, but there's definitely been a slowdown in utility PV farms getting to financial close and getting into the construction phase. And we've turned this period in time, say from, we call it Q4 last year up until the present, the kind of the eye of the storm, where we essentially have multiple factors which all present hurdles to the industry all coming together at the same time. So I won't touch in detail on many of these just simply due to time constraints. Policy at a federal level we could talk about for an hour. There's recently been rule changes in Queensland that require qualified electricians to perform mounting of all panels and modules on the utility PV farms when this was formerly done by labourers. And the plot on the right shows the full pipeline of utility PV by state. And when you start to include what's got a development application or what's even applied for a development application, you see that rightfully so, Queensland is the place with the largest pipeline of when you include all stages of development. And so this rule change is really putting this DA approved pipeline of projects of over 10 gigawatts in a stall mode. So we do expect, as the industry starts to grapple with these new rules, that we see a stall in Queensland. The other key challenge that I wanted to talk about was the construction and the commissioning of utility PV farms in Australia. And this plot is related to the EPC fallout of RCR, who were our biggest utility PV EPC. And some of our statistics that we gather are to do with project timelines. And what you see in the plot is essentially a box plot where the green represents 25% of our projects that we have data for, the orange 50%, and the red includes 75%. And the dots you see on screen are essentially RCR projects. So during the construction phase, there's an even spread of some of the projects that we have data for. But during the commissioning phase, we see that a lot of these projects took longer than the standard in the industry. So it's in this period where you can get burnt as an EPC. Last but not least, we don't have time, unfortunately, to talk about the new generator standards as well as transmission losses, which are known as the marginal loss factors in the industry. But asset management is another key one which will get talked on today, and really look forward to the following presentations on this topic. So going a bit more into the technical detail, what we're seeing in the industry in terms of the technology being used, on the left-hand side is essentially the module types that are being used and the cell types in these utility PV farms, and for the year in which they're commissioned. And you can see just from 2018 to 2020 how rapidly the technology is changing from a module type. We're going from these thin film multi-crystalline aluminium back surface field modules and cells through to 2020, when we've gone past into the mono-ed PERC, and we're starting to see a lot of bifacial entering the market. On the right-hand side, you simply see whether a utility PV farm is single axis tracking or is fixed. And you can see now that the standard here is tracking comes with every utility PV farm. Moving on, so who are the big players in the Australia sector? So what you see on the screen is the top 5 utility PV developers by equity, and they're color-coded here by the EPCs that they work with. And one of the most striking features of this chart is the majority of the names here are foreign names. So foreign developers and EPCs essentially dominates the Australia market. So Neoen working with Bouygues in many solar farms in New South Wales, a lot of them commissioned last year. Versol worked with Bouygues and RCR on a lot of projects in Victoria and Queensland. John Lang Energy and Octopus came in with big splashes in terms of the size and scale of the projects that have come in here. John Lang had the Finley and the Sunraysia projects. Energy are building the greater than 300 megawatt Limondale asset, and Octopus Investments, the Darlington Point asset with Canadian Solar and Signal. To round this out, we started to gather the statistics of once these assets enter the operate phase, who's actually doing the asset management, and we've broken it down by owner, developer, and third party. And the trend you see here is a lot of the owners are doing the asset management in Australia, with some of them putting the responsibility with the developer and a few going with a third party. It's important to note that Australia is at the very early stages of asset management, with majority of utility PV coming online within the last 18 months. And it'll be interesting to see how this chart changes over the next 2 to 3 years as we start to move into that asset management phase of the asset's life cycle. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Lizette, and thank you all for your time and attendance.
Thank you, David, for that insightful presentation with some nice statistics. Interesting to see how the market is developing, and also the recent changes and issues and challenges that we're facing as a market as a whole. And I do think also the question you raised in the end in terms of how the owner versus third-party asset management will change is definitely something that Bea might have some thoughts upon. So I think it's a nice bridge to our next speaker. Beatriz works as a senior manager asset management services at Blueshore. She will give a short introduction herself of what Blueshore does, but she will comment from an asset management perspective on the topic of today. She has over 6 years of experience in the renewable energy sector in companies like Blueshore, where she is currently, but also ABB and Vector Quattro in the past. She has an extensive educational background in industrial engineering in Madrid, also renewable energy masters, as well as a postgraduate degree in business. So that might give her a nice background to also talk on the next topic with regards to how do we perform asset management, what is it, and what's the importance of it. So Bea, I'm looking forward to you answering these questions, and I'm happy to give the floor to you to take it off from here.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisette. So, well, thank you very much, Lisette, for the introduction, and thank you, David, for the very comprehensive snapshot of the market. So, a bit of introduction about Blueshore. Blueshore was established in 2017 by an European asset management business, with a record providing asset management services in the renewable energy sector since 2009. With experience working on over 90 individual renewable assets, Blueshore has aimed to build upon a decade of asset and engineering experience to support the growth of the renewable energy sector in Australia, using our experience working with 20 different international EPC and O&M contractors, equipment technologies, and SCADA platforms. Okay. So the poll question that we have is, what is your key concern with regards to managing assets? So I think, well, I expect for Australia, the answer will be regulatory compliance. This market can be quite difficult, especially, well, also during the operational phase, when we're talking about market participation and grid connection in terms of having the generator compliance program and maintaining of these requirements. That's something that asset owners and asset managers need to keep an eye on. So let's see what the result is.
So let's check the results. I'm just going to read out once more the question and answer options. So what's your key concern with regards to managing assets? Is it A, regulatory compliance, B, performance calculation and validation, C, defect identification and punch list management, or D, stakeholder management? So if you could please cast your vote, then Bea will comment on the results. So here they are, Bea, take it off.
Perfect. So as expected, we have regulatory compliance 40%. As I said, Australia has very strong requirements around, during the operational phase, around market participation. And also as part of the grid connection, everyone talks about the generator performance standards, but there is life after that. And then you have what I mentioned is the generator compliance program that needs to be maintained during the lifetime of the project. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. And the is responsibility of the asset managers to make sure that this is in place. Okay. So coming back to the presentation. Okay. So focusing in Australia and the solar energy market, this has suffered an amazing structural shift in the last couple of years with almost 2 gigawatts of installed capacity in operation. However, this is translated just in a very small number of projects, and therefore the presence of the asset management role is still in an early stage that will keep growing with the number of projects being commissioned. With this rapid growth of the market, it is becoming evident that we need a hands-on management, which means asset management and operation and maintenance. On the left side of this slide, I have listed the activities that would normally fall within the scope of the asset management and the operation and maintenance contractors. So normally, asset management would be considered the ongoing management of financial and commercial and administrative tasks. However, there is a key component which is known as technical asset management that will include the performance monitoring of the projects, the supervision of the EPC and O&M contractor with the punch list management and the identification of defects, and also the management of the guarantee of the EPC and the equipment. So this is quite key to have the technical background to be able to supervise all these items. And then, of course, for the operation and maintenance, this is commonly known as the set of activities of more technical nature. Given the difference in the core competencies and to avoid any conflict of interest, asset management and O&M activities are normally offered by different parties, as was highlighted in David's presentation. So, as mentioned, one of the key services in order to manage the project operation is the performance monitoring and the associated data analysis. As part of this analysis, we will be able to identify faults on site, monitoring the response of the contractors to identify this fault and carry out the corrective works. And we will follow up to make sure that this fault has been rectified after the activities on site has been completed. These activities and this data analysis can also be applied to the preventive maintenance. So let's say, for instance, there are some works that will require an equipment outage. We will be able to monitor with the monitoring platform to make sure that this has happened within the agreed time frame in the O&M calendar. To a certain extent, this analysis can also be applied to detect when some activities such as module cleaning or landscape management have been some cases neglected by the contractor. We can see in the right side of the slide a project where the overgrown vegetation was obviously affecting the performance of the project. However, this is just the surface. In a country like Australia, where the remote location and the large size of the projects may make prohibitive any additional on-site testing, performance monitoring has even more value in order to identify or prevent underlying defects on site. This is what we want to call preventive monitoring. So the process that we will normally suggest to follow to carry out this preventive monitoring, we will start first making sure that the data that we have is correct. So first of all, data acquisition, sampling, recording, and reporting. We need to make sure that we have interval consistency, and also that there is an alignment between the recording interval when we're using data coming from different sources. So let's say, for instance, the export energy for the project when it's compared against the irradiance values for the performance ratio calculation. Also for the daylight hours, sounds a bit obvious, but we need to make sure that we have only data during the day. If we have data coming from the parameters during the night, that's not correct. Then we have missing or invalid data. Having missing data on irradiance measurements when we're calculating the performance ratio could cause that this value of the PR is falsely increased. So that's something that we need to keep an eye on. And then, of course, we have equipment calibration. We need to make sure that the equipment on site is calibrated and recalibrated as per the manufacturer specifications. Once this data has been confirmed to be valid, we will narrow down the area of underperformance from the point of connection to the transformer, inverter, commander boxes, and finally string level. Then we will check if there is alignment on of the values with equipment specification and performance guarantees, alignment with the project design and EPC performance guarantees, and then, of course, we will analyze if there is any pattern that we can identify and correlation with previous faults detected in this project, or even this could be compared against other projects that we have in the portfolio under management. So on the right side of the slide, we have a case study where on the chart in the upper part, this is a representative sample of the inverter AC power measurements in a project where a large number of the string inverters across the site will regularly start their operation later than expected. Further data analysis led to identification of a serial defect in the module interconnectors where the distortion on the cap threads allowed moisture to penetrate during the early morning, causing insulation faults, and in some cases corrosion, as you can see in the pictures. Fortunately, this issue was picked and rectified in an early stage, avoiding major losses and equipment damage. So in the next slide, we have a second case study where one of the projects that we were managing started showing little after reaching practical completion and their performance in comparison with expected performance rate values. Following the detection of this underperformance and with the data analysis process included in the previous slide, we managed to narrow down the root cause of the underperformance to the string level. Through this analysis of the historical data, you can see a snapshot of the string output current on the right side of the slide. And the comparison between the string underperformance patterns, we were able to identify the strings with abnormalities. And for all these strings, a subsequent electroluminescence inspection and thermal analysis was conducted on a random subsample of the first one, which confirmed the suspicion for PID in this project, which caused the accelerated degradation on the performance of the modules. So for these two cases studies, what we want to conclude is that defects that could have taken a significant amount of testing on site to identify them, and therefore an increasing loss of production, were not only raised in an early stage, they were identified using mainly data analytics. So focusing now in Australia and its energy market, I think it's worth highlighting a series of facts that affect the way projects are operated in Australia. So first of all, I think we need to talk about dimensions. We need to bear in mind that Australia has the world's longest interconnected power system, as opposed to the transmission networks in Europe, where they tend to be meshed and of far higher density. Also, the assets are located far away from the main population areas, equipment factories, and shipping ports. This makes manpower and equipment resource far more difficult than in other parts of the world. I think in the images on the right side of the presentation, I have included, there's two maps that have been overlapped. One of them is with the population density in Australia. Another one is a map of Europe. You can see, well, if we want to go in a project that is in New South Wales and we're living from Sydney, we may drive for hours and we are not even halfway through. While if you are carrying out a site inspection in the UK, you will be for sure in your destination. So that's something to bear in mind. Another key point is the regulatory compliance. The electricity trading conducted in the NEM is a spot market where supply and demand are matched in real time, with the asset owners bidding every 30 minutes and dispatch done every 5 minutes. However, this is only for the NEM. West Australia, with the wholesale market, and the Northern Territory are not connected to the NEM, and they have their own electricity systems and separate regulatory arrangements. So Australia electricity system can therefore be pictured as unique in terms of its long distances, low density, and long thin structure, and it's a small demand in comparison to the continuously increasing generation pipeline, in addition to complex regulatory requirements. So the question is how owners manage these particularities in this market, and how do they minimize the risk exposure? So I have highlighted the importance of the performance monitoring in the previous slides for preventive purposes. Long distances in Australia will difficult response time and equipment supply. Therefore, if we're able to anticipate and avoid faults through data analysis and preventive monitoring, the risk of unnecessary works on site and extended equipment outages will be minimized. This is supported by the asset management site inspections, which in combination with the insight acquired as part of the data analysis will allow early detection of defects on site and ensure these are being raised within the EPC and manufacturer guarantee period. Another key watch point for asset management is the identification of any equipment fault or defects to ensure that those are treated and rectified as per the contractual requirements. Contract management is key for asset owners and to ensure that any defect, non-compliance, or project underperformance is raised within the project guarantee periods, and that the resolution of these issues is closely monitored by the technical asset manager. A separate and fundamental component as part of the asset management services is the management of unexpected events, such as extreme weather conditions, network outages, or health and safety issues. When a matter that could affect the integrity of the project, reduce the energy output, or affect the well-being of the personnel on site arise, it is fundamental that the right steps are taken and parties involved are coordinated for a prompt resolution. Finally, as raised in the previous slide, it is the responsibility of the asset manager to ensure that the project operates and participates in the market in compliance with the national electricity law and the national electricity rules. And we have to keep ourselves up to speed about any upcoming changes that may affect the way we manage the project. It is very important to highlight that the successful integration and operation of this first generation of renewable energy projects in Australia is a crucial driver to the successful acceptance of the renewables in the market, and the first step in a small structural shift in Australia energy infrastructure. Okay. So I think this is the last slide. I know it was a lot of information, so if you have any question, please do not hesitate to send me an email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bea. Indeed, a very insightful presentation with really nice cases and examples, and also highlighting the value of asset management, giving a first introduction there. I think it's worthwhile to note that this will also be continued in the conference in more detail. This was just an initial outline of what asset management is, and we'll further explore that together also with Blueshore in the conference. So thanks, Bea, and then we're going to continue to our next speaker, who can talk a little bit more also on the data side, because Bea already mentioned the importance of the data that goes in terms of analysis. And we have Ioannis Grammatikakis today on board. He's a senior product manager at Inaccess, and he's able to talk from a monitoring perspective on asset management. Ioannis is responsible for the Smart Infrastructure Solutions product line at Inaccess, which is focused on the energy and telecom markets. He's one of the founding members of the company, and he also heads the company division in the UK. So happy to have you on board so early this morning, Ioannis. He has a diploma in electrical and computer engineering. He's a member of the technical chamber in Greece, and he also has an MBA, so a long list also in terms of his past experience and background. So Ioannis, I'm happy to give the floor to you to talk a little bit more on the monitoring and how that actually helps to steer solar plant performance.
Thank you, Lisette, and thank you all for attending this webinar. As Bea already discussed before, the importance of data and how to analyze, it's very crucial to understand the performance of the asset and optimize it. So from my side, we will discuss a bit more about what the SCADA is doing and how to select a good SCADA, why is this important, and of course, what are the functions that will help you during the construction, the connection of the solar asset, and the operation during the next 20 or 25 or more years to come. Before starting, I would like to introduce our company for those that they don't know us. So Inaccess is now 20 years old company, so quite big history in the renewable energy sector. And we are providing SCADA, monitoring and control solution for renewable assets, focusing on solar. We have global coverage, so as you can see in the small map, we have presence and installations all around the world in all 4 continents. And we have more than 10 gigawatts of solar assets now under our management in more than 2,000 sites, and with plants that range from small installations like 100 kilowatt up to 1.2 gigawatt as a single installation. All the global infrastructure now and the energy resources are getting more and more digitalized. So our mission is to maximize the value of this infrastructure by using smart monitoring, control, and analytics, and also ease the penetration of the renewable energy resources in the electricity mix. That will be, in my opinion, and according to several other companies that do research, it will prevail in the next 20 or 30 years. Before starting, I have a poll question for you, which is what are the key business activities? A, developer owner, B, asset manager, C, EPC, D, O&M service provider, or other, because depending on who you are, you may have some different interests in selecting and operating the SCADA. So it will be interesting to see.
So, Ioannis, traditionally, what would you expect? Who would be most interested in discussing the topic of SCADA and monitoring? What are your expectations?
Depends on the market. In a more mature market like Europe, in a webinar like this, we will have a lot of asset managers and O&M. In markets like Australia that are in an early phase still, I would expect more developers and EPCs.
Okay, so let's bring the results on and see who's today joining the webinar.
But we have a surprise here. We have more other, which is 42%. And then the next is development and owner with 26%. And then a split of asset managers and EPCs like 11%. So as I said before, the SCADA is very, very important for all the players in this market because it is essentially the eyes of the owner, the asset manager, and the O&M. It's with the SCADA that you are going to collect, store, process, cleanse, analyze, visualize your data. You can evaluate the design of your plant. You can also evaluate the plant performance, find problems with alarms, and of course facilitate the operation and maintenance with these alarms, and also understand cases of underperformances and optimize the performance. But not only this, because nowadays all the solar plants and the renewable energy assets must be controlled. SCADA brings remote control and is the grid integration. So it is the operation with remote control, but it also allows the solar asset to be a part of the electricity grid. And in Australia, where the grid requirements are very, very strict, it's very important to have a good power plant controller that enables this seamless integration with your grid. And it's not only this, with the grid integration and the control functions, you can add additional revenue streams in your assets with provision of ancillary services that are becoming more and more popular, like frequency support, like voltage support of the grid. And this will become more easy with the addition of battery energy storage. So this combination of solar and battery, as the batteries will become cheaper and cheaper in the future, I think will contribute very largely in the adoption of solar worldwide. And a good control is necessary to optimize this performance. Let's discuss a bit about how to select a SCADA. What are the key points you have to take care? As you can see from this slide, the majority of them are during the design and installation phase, because it is then that you decide what is a SCADA to be used. So you have to do the appropriate sizing and the appropriate selection of sensors as equipment so as to join optimize the cost and the quality of data. Then the network design itself is very important so as to allow a fast and reliable inter-plant communication. Now that the plants are big, and in Australia, the smaller plant can be 50 or 100 megs, it is important to have, for example, separate network paths for data acquisition and control so as not to have any bottlenecks. Correct data acquisition, as Bea mentioned before. You have to be very careful with the sampling rate, with cleansing of the raw data, how you do the average, how you timestamp, everything must be aligned, all the data must be reliable. Another very important consideration is the cybersecurity. Since remote access or central system, cloud system are necessary to do your work efficiently, we have to have cybersecurity. Luckily, there are standards like ISO 27001 that details all the processes and the systems that must be in place to assure that there is no cybersecurity threat. And as we discussed before, also the selection of the power plant controller is very, very important, because without a good and tested, well-designed power plant controller, most probably your asset will not be connected to the grid. The COD will be delayed by days, weeks, or months, and this can be catastrophic. Once you have select and install a good SCADA, then during the operation phase, it's more about maintenance. So all you need is the vendor of your SCADA to be supportive, to provide support, to solve any issues that may arise during the operation of the plant, that will be the next 20 years, and also to provide new features to make the life of all the involved parties easier. So, how we can optimize performance? I was thinking about it, and at the end I borrowed a slide from our product marketing presentation for our product Unity, because this is a combination of things. The SCADA must be able to provide several functionalities, and as you can see in this slide, those can be divided in two main categories. So as we discussed, we have the monitoring, which is the data acquisition, alerts, KPIs, dashboards, and all the stuff. We have the control that we have discussed, but on top of this, we have the O&M and asset management systems. So you have to have a system capable to integrate CMMS, computerized maintenance management system, also to be able to integrate with other third-party asset management platforms so as to ease the corrective maintenance and all the management of the plant. And on top of that, since we have this ocean of data, you need tools in business intelligence platforms that are able to run advanced analytics and draw conclusions and provide them to the end users in a way that they have some actionable results. Let me give you an example of what you can save with a good SCADA, only for the fast response. So imagine we have a 40 megawatt plant somewhere in Australia, and as Bea said before, the distances are long in Australia. So if the main enclosure goes off, let's say at 11 a.m. or in the morning, so the whole plant is disconnected, you start losing energy that can be delivered to the grid. With a traditional approach that you have to do the diagnosis and send someone on site, it can take, let's say, 6 hours. So you have 6 hours with no production. With a good system, where the troubleshooting is fast, you can do all your diagnosis fast, and you can remotely log in and reliable, because this is the key point to be able to reliable do the closure reset. You can do all this in an hour. So with an average production of 160 megawatt hours per day, this will avoid the loss of, with an average price of $100 per megawatt hour, which is the wholesale price. This will save you $9,000 just for a single incident, maybe more. Maybe the site visit costs more, or maybe the actual loss is more, depending on the time of the year. But as an average, we can see for a single incident, you can save this money. So the actual selection of SCADA is an important thing. Analytics. We have tons of data, tons of data points. How can we use them to increase the performance of the asset? I have this slide from what we provide and what we are working on for analytics. So as you can see, there is 4 main categories of analytics. There are the first category, which is data quality analytics. It is about the health of the instruments. So you can find pyranometers, sensors that are not performing well. And this is very important so as to have good data to do the analysis. And there are ways to automatically curate those data with machine learning and either supervised or unsupervised algorithms. And then we have analytics that help in operations. And those analytics are mainly visual analytics. So it is a way you present the results, like a good heat map of the inverter, so to understand if you have shading or if you have underperformances in your inverters, and some machine learning algorithms that can enhance your alarm management, so as to suppress some alarms that are not, for example, you have shading and you have some alarm, but you know it, and the system understands this and suppress these alarms. The third category, which is also very important, is the recognition of fault and underperformance. And this is done usually at the inverter or string level. And so you can easily understand parts of your asset that is underperforming, and the algorithms are able to understand some trends and detects some issues that then are flagged so as to go and repair them. And last but not least, we have the predictive analytics, which can be production forecasting based on algorithms, so as to understand what is the expected power and compare it to the actual power, and also the understand of the trends of fault, so as to predict something before it happens, so as to predict an inverter failure before it happens and go and do something so as to save time and increase your performance. And let me close giving you another example of what can you achieve with the performance optimization. I have used PER, performance index, but you can use actual energy, you can use performance index or whatever index you use to characterize the performance. So imagine in a 100 megawatt plant, if you achieve a 2% increase of the PR, let's say for 78% to 80%, which is not something so difficult, all with identifying performance issues with string and inverters and minimize the expected downtime, this can be easily achieved. So with an average production of 1,400 kilowatt hours per kilowatt per year, this 2% difference in PR translate in 2% difference in produced energy, which is this amount is 2,800 megawatt hours per year. And with an average price of $100, this can give you back almost $300,000 on average. So you understand how important it is, and it is the time you spend in doing this performance optimization, it is worth and give you back a lot of money. And with this slide, I want to thank you, and we can proceed with any questions you may have. Is that?
Thank you, Ioannis, for the insightful presentation as well, and for these clear examples on how SCADA and good monitoring systems can actually increase performance, save a lot of money. So interesting to also see how you link this to some real life cases. So now we're reaching the Q&A time, and I'm still inviting the audience also throughout this conversation to raise any questions you might have for the speakers in the question box in the webinar pop-up. We'll try to take as many questions as possible in these remaining minutes, but any questions that remain open we'll address with the speakers also after the webinar. So please feel invited also throughout the Q&A to raise your questions. I would like to start actually with the question that David already threw up at the end of his presentation, looking at the owner landscape in Australia. And first, having a small practical question from someone in the audience with regards to the slides that you had, David, whether the data that you presented are based on a calendar year or a financial year, just to clarify what we're talking about.
Yeah, hi Lizette. Just to clarify, it was calendar year, not financial year.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. So looking at the calendar years, we saw the developments. We saw some numbers also for the division between owners and asset managers with regards to third-party providers. So my question would be, as you asked, so what are the key differences we see in such a distribution between the Australian market, which is maybe more in a developing phase, versus a market like Europe, where we're already a bit further in terms of maturity? Bea, could you maybe comment on that, on how you see differences there?
So I guess, yeah, the main difference is that here in Australia, for the moment, there is quite a limited number of parties providing third-party service for asset management. So I guess it has been the case here that the market was growing very fast. As I said, we have right now 2 gigawatts of operational capacity, and that has happened in just a couple of years. So I think it was the growth of the market what forced some developers to and asset owners to take this responsibility instead of using a third party. And I think this is where we are catching up now with, I guess, third parties like Blueshore providing this kind of service.
Okay, thanks for answering that question. David, linking it to the parties that you also mentioned in your slides, what are your expectations in terms of how that landscape will develop? Do you expect the division between international and local players to stay similar, or do you see some trends there where you might see the landscape also changing within Australia?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a number of different points there in terms of, I guess one was on who the developers are at the top end and where the asset management is going to be, and also whether or not they're international or local. And some of those I think I feel confident to answer, and some I'd leave it to more the Beatriz and Ioannis in the European space, just because I'm not familiar so much with the European market. Definitely we expect the landscape in the development space to reshuffle, and internally there's a lot of scope in Australia from development from parties that's traditionally you wouldn't or you might not expect in Australia. So we do expect international players to keep entering Australia, as well as local some local players contributing as well. We do have major utilities here as well, and an organisation, or I guess a part of the industry that we do expect to see really enter this space, maybe not so much this year, but we are starting to hear rumours, or not even rumours, but the oil and gas industry, we expect to be big investors in the renewable space as well. So another different segment kind of waiting to enter the space as well.
Indeed. So in the bigger energy space, also some transitions. Thanks for putting that in a bigger perspective. Linking that then to Ioannis, because I'm also curious to hear how he looks at that from a monitoring perspective. If a landscape would change and if the market will develop in the terms of how Bea and David described it, what would you expect to see in the monitoring landscape? Do you expect any changes there as well? Focus on SCADA. Any comments on that?
Yes, the change that is actually performing is the shift more in control functionality. So traditionally with solar plants, I don't know, 10 years ago, it was only monitoring. Now it's more and more about control. So actually how you control your plant, how you can provide more services, not just giving power to the grid, which is of course the main purpose of the asset, but also provide on top of these services, make the asset more live in the market, a more live participation in the spot market, like all other source of energy, the traditional sources of energy. This is coming more and more common nowadays. And and with the grid parity that is reaching in many countries, and in Australia, of course, that everything is with PPAs and auctions, and there's no feed-in tariffs as the market started, I don't know, 15 years ago in Germany. Now control is very, very important.
Okay, so I think you already touched upon some points that the audience were interested in, but I also see here a question regarding the effects of energy storage. So the question is, from your perspective, what are recommended SCADA specificities for assets including energy storage? I think that's also one of the major trends we see, of course.
Yes, the SCADA that combines solar and energy. Of course, it must be able to get the data and monitor both assets, which is, let's say, the easy part. The control, again, is important there. How to optimize those two? How are you able to have information, real-time information of the market price, so as to optimize the performance, so as to export energy when the price is high, to import energy and charge your batteries when the price is low. How you are able to achieve, let's say, providing some frequency response to the grid while there is no enough sun, so your batteries must be fully charged. So this is a complex combination, technical combination that allows all the revenue streams to be active.
Yeah, so, and as you mentioned in the beginning, summarizing, it's really about the control part because there are so many complex elements that come together.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
And also to have a clear view of what are the control functions. So you have to have a real fast sampling so as afterwards to be able to check that everything has been performed correctly and understand if there's any issues with the grid and all the stuff.
Okay, I think this is also an interesting topic to continue discussing in the conference where we have sessions on storage as well as monitoring. So thanks for your answer. Then I have another question here for, let's see, Bea. The question that was raised is, what focus do you see within solar asset management on connection transformers and HV infrastructure?
Sorry, Rystad, can you repeat the question?
Which type of focus do you see within the solar asset management domain on connection transformers and on HV infrastructure?
So, well, from the asset management perspective, we'll be supervising the operations on site. And as mentioned, as part of the technical asset management, we will review that these works are being done as per the design of the project and in accordance with the good industry practices. But I guess asset management is not part of the scope to participate in the design activities such as installing transformers in that case. But we will be part of our scope to supervise those works.
Yeah, so indeed, in the supervising of these kinds of topics, you will be involved. That's your focus. Okay, thanks for answering that question. So then I have one more question for David. We're jumping a bit from topic to topic, but we have quite a diverse range of questions. David, what impact do you expect will more extreme price duck curves have on utility scale solar in Australia in the future? That's a question of our audience. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there are multiple ways to take this. I mean, whenever you have such low prices or low demand, you're essentially incentivizing demand in what way, shape, or form. in that case, potentially a storage market really develops. What that means for utility PV is potentially you start to see utility PV farms really enter into the storage space, and we're kind of in this awkward period at the moment where storage is just not economic at the current prices. But as the costs really start to come tumbling down for storage, we can see a market where in the not too distant future, you'll see batteries start to be added to these PV plants. And so we do expect to see low prices in some markets, but potentially temporary as soon as storage becomes readily available.
Okay, thanks for your comment on that. Again, we see the topic of storage having a major impact on the things we discussed. So sadly, as it's now already an hour since we started, we'll have to soon wrap up. We do have some open questions. I will share those with the speakers afterwards, but also please feel invited to send them an email if you have any further questions. So my last question before we head to the roundup of today's webinar is I'm curious to hear from you, if we would conduct this webinar in 5 years from now, what would be your expectations for the asset management space in Australia? Where would we be in terms of the markets? Maybe we can start with David, first commenting on that, and then we'll let the other two give a final short pitch on it. Few words on where would we be in 5 years if we do the webinar again?
Yeah, sure. I think firstly, I think you'll see the technology in the plants change, and as such, the scope of the asset management services change over time. I don't think we're typically moving to bifacial as the standard in the future from a panel tech and what that means for equipment and optimization. I think point two would be on that layout of who the asset managers are. I think as it becomes very much as the issues start to become apparent in the industry, and particularly specialized solutions in Australia, which does hold unique challenges relative to other more mature markets like Europe, which Beatriz touched on, you might start to see specialist services starting to do this. So I would expect the asset management breakdown by who's doing it to also change over time. Okay, thanks. Bea, do you agree with that view? What are your thoughts?
Well, I do agree with the view. I think the market is going to become more focused on asset management services and the expertise around the issues that are going to arise as soon as we start seeing the projects fully operational. And I think I can expect that the asset management services are going to become more focused on the technical issues. As David said, many projects are now currently under construction. So I would say in many cases, the asset management activities are focused on issues arising from the construction site, but we're still waiting to see what happens once the projects are under operation, because there's always things going on during that stage. So I think there will be a special focus on the operational technical activities on the project.
Okay, thanks, Bea. So the focus on technical aspects of the project, Ioannis, do you have thoughts about that from a monitoring perspective, maybe to add to Bea's view?
Yes, the discussion will be again on how to analyze all this data and how to draw valuable conclusions, more analytics, new analytics, more machine learning algorithms, and how this helps finding issues and optimize the performance.
Thank you. With that, I would like to thank all the speakers for their insightful presentations today, and we'll head to a short roundup. So given this conversation that we started today on solar asset management, we see that there's still a lot to discuss. So you're invited to also join the conference to continue this discussion with all the key players in the industry to further grow what we call solar asset management and performance of solar assets on the long term. And I'm shortly sharing also with you the event agenda. Looking ahead, we're not only organizing Solar Asset Management Australia, but we'll have Solar Asset Management Asia coming up also already in a couple of days. And if you're based in Europe, we'll have the Solar Future Netherlands and Solar Market Parity Italy also on the agenda for the months to come. I invite everyone who has a question regarding this to contact me. Feel free to have a look at the website, but I'm very happy to thank David, Bea, and Ioannis for their insightful presentations, for sharing their knowledge, for giving some thought-provoking insights. And I would love to continue this discussion with all of you in Australia on the 26th and 27th of June. With that, I would like to wrap up today's webinar. Thanks all for your time and for attending, and hope to see you soon. Have a great evening or day.